A biker vanished on Route 7, and everyone thought he was gone for good. But weeks later, something impossible happened. His voice came through a late-night radio show. A heartbroken widow recognizes the sound instantly. It's him. The same laugh, the same words he whispered before every ride. But there's one problem. His wrecked motorcycle was already found, miles away, buried in the desert. Now, strange broadcasts are reaching people across the state. Veterans, widows, and lost souls. All claiming they've heard the same man's voice comforting them through static. Is it a ghost? A miracle? Or something far more mysterious? As the search for the truth turns into a journey of faith, one woman must follow the voice of the man she lost, before the final message fades forever. What if love doesn't die? It just finds another frequency. The amber glow of the old table lamp cast long shadows across Sarah Mitchell's living room. She sat in her worn leather recliner, the one Bob had insisted on buying years ago, because it was built to last. The radio on the side table hummed softly, filling the quiet house with the familiar voice of Pete Carson, the local late-night DJ. And that was Midnight Train to Georgia for all you night owls out there, Pete drawled in his characteristic dry tone. It's 11:42 p.m. here at KZRX, and you're listening to Desert Night Talk. Lines are open if anyone's feeling chatty. Sarah pulled her quilted throw closer around her shoulders. These late nights had become her routine since Bob disappeared 6 weeks ago. Sleep was harder to find now, and Pete's show helped fill the emptiness of the house. Her eyes drifted to the collection of framed photos on the wall. Bob in his leather vest, standing proud next to his Harley. Another showed him delivering supplies to Mrs. Henderson out in Apache Junction, one of his many mercy rides as he called them. The radio crackled with static, making her stir from her half-sleep. She reached over to adjust the dial, but stopped. Through the interference, she heard something that made her heart skip a beat. "Sweet Sarah, my desert rose." The voice was scratchy, distant, but unmistakable. It was Bob's voice, singing the first line of the lullaby he'd made up for her during their first year of marriage. Sarah sat bolt upright, her hands trembling. "No," she whispered. "It can't be." But it was. The static cleared for just a moment, and his voice came through again. "Watching over you, beneath the desert moon." Sarah's fingers fumbled with her phone, punching in the station's number that she knew by heart. Her heart pounded as it rang. "Desert Night Talk, you're on the air," Pete's voice answered, somehow both bored and amused. "Pete," Sarah's voice cracked. "Pete, it's Sarah Mitchell, Bob's wife." There was a slight pause. Pete's tone softened. He knew her story well. "Sarah, how are you holding up?" "I heard him, Pete. I heard Bob." The words tumbled out. "Just now, on your station. He was singing our song, the one he wrote for me. The Desert Rose Lullaby. Nobody else knows that song." "Sarah." Pete's voice carried gentle concern. "We haven't played any music for the past 20 minutes, just commercials and weather." No, you don't understand." Sarah clutched the phone tighter. It came through during the static. "Please, Pete, you must have recorded it. Your station records everything, doesn't it?" Pete sighed, and Sarah could picture him rubbing his temple like he always did when dealing with difficult callers. "We do keep a buffer, yes. Give me a moment." Sarah heard keyboard clicks in the background. Her free hand gripped the arm of the recliner, knuckles white with tension. The house felt suddenly too quiet, too still, as if the whole world was holding its breath. "Okay," Pete's voice returned. "I'm going to replay the last few minutes, just to be thorough." The radio fell silent for a moment, then crackled back to life. Sarah heard Pete's weather announcement, then the static, and then, there it was. Bob's voice, distant but clear enough. "Sweet Sarah, my desert rose. Oh my God." Pete's voice cut in, all professional detachment gone. I hear it too." The station's phone lines lit up like Christmas trees. Pete's call screener was suddenly overwhelmed. "Sarah, stay on the line," Pete said quickly. "We're getting multiple calls. Hold on." He patched in another caller. "Desert Night Talk, you're on the air." "I heard it too," an elderly woman's voice declared. "That man, singing about a desert rose. I'm out here in Tucson. Thought my radio was acting up." Another caller patched through. "Same here in Flagstaff. Clear as day through the static." Sarah's hands shook so badly she could barely hold the phone. "Pete," she whispered. "All these people, they heard him too?" "Looks that way," Pete replied, his voice tight with confusion. "We've got calls coming in from all over the state. Sarah, has Bob did he know anything about radio transmissions?" "No," Sarah said. "He could barely program our coffee maker." A sob caught in her throat, half laugh, half cry. "But that's his voice. That's our song. Pete, he's out there somewhere. He's alive." Pete was silent for a moment, then spoke with a gravity that cut through his usual cynicism. "Folks, if you're just tuning in, we're experiencing something I can't explain. Multiple listeners across Arizona are reporting the same voice, coming through static, singing about a desert rose. The voice belongs to Bob Mitchell, a local veteran who disappeared 6 weeks ago while making supply deliveries to elderly residents in remote areas." The phone lines continued to flash. Pete's voice grew more animated with each confirmation. Sarah sat in her recliner, tears streaming down her face, as stranger after stranger described hearing Bob's voice carried on the desert wind. "Sarah," Pete said finally, "I don't know what's happening here, but something is. Would you like to say something? To Bob, in case he's listening?" Sarah wiped her eyes and took a deep breath. "Bob," she said, her voice stronger now. "If you can hear me, if you're out there somewhere, I love you. Come home. Whatever's happened, wherever you are, just come home." The static returned, stronger this time, and through it came 3 clear words in Bob's voice. "I'm trying, sweetheart." The morning sun cast long shadows across the cracked pavement as Sarah Jenkins pulled her weathered Buick into the radio station's nearly empty parking lot. The building itself wasn't much to look at. A squat, sand-colored structure with a tall radio tower reaching into the cloudless Arizona sky, a faded sign reading KDES 99.5, the voice of the desert, hung slightly crooked above the entrance. Sarah's hands trembled as she gathered her things. A steel thermos full of coffee she knew she wouldn't drink, and a worn leather photo album she'd looked through 1,000 times since Tom disappeared. Her wedding ring caught the early light as she pushed open the car door. Inside, the station's lobby was cool and dim, with wood-paneled walls decorated with old concert posters and local sports team pennants. A sleepy receptionist looked up from her crossword puzzle. "I need to speak with Doug," Sarah said, her voice steadier than she felt. "Doug Martinez, the late-night host, about last night's show." The receptionist's expression softened with recognition. "Oh, Mrs. Jenkins, he's actually still here. Pulled a double shift to help with the morning crew. Let me call back." A few minutes later, Doug appeared, younger than his radio voice suggested, with kind eyes and yesterday's 5 o'clock shadow. He wore a faded band t-shirt and clutched a coffee mug like a lifeline. "Mrs. Jenkins," he said warmly, "I was hoping you'd come by. That was quite a night, wasn't it?" Sarah nodded, pulling out the photo album. "I brought something. I thought maybe—" Her voice caught. "I need to know if it was really him." Doug gestured toward a hallway lined with soundproofing foam. "Come on back. Our tech guy, Marcus, he's been looking into it since his shift started. Something about anomalies in the system." They found Marcus in the control room, hunched over 3 computer monitors. He barely looked up when they entered, his fingers flying over the keyboard. Thick-rimmed glasses reflected lines of code. "Show her what you found," Doug said. Marcus cleared his throat, clearly more comfortable with machines than people.
The system logged 3 automatic uploads at 2:47 a.m. Voicemails, but, he frowned. They're not from our normal voicemail box. It's like they came from somewhere else. Sarah placed the photo album on the desk, opening to a recent picture of Tom. In it, he stood next to his Harley, gray hair tied back, wearing his favorite leather vest covered in veteran patches. His smile was gentle, always a surprise to those who first met him, expecting a tough biker and finding a soft-spoken man instead. "Can we?" Sarah swallowed hard. "Can we listen to them?" Marcus nodded, clicking a few buttons. The room filled with static, then cleared. Tom's voice emerged, as familiar to Sarah as her own heartbeat. "Testing, testing. Don't know if this'll work, but if you're hearing this..." Sarah grabbed Doug's arm. "That's him. That's Tom." They listened to the first message, mostly interference and scattered words about roads and stars. The second message, though, came through clearer. "If you find this, follow the sun. Follow the wind. There's still light where I'm going." There was a pause, then Tom's voice rattled off a string of numbers. 34 degrees, 17 minutes north. 111 degrees, 43 minutes west. Marcus was already plotting the coordinates on a map. "It's out in the Superstition Mountains, about 3 hours from here." "There's one more message," Doug said quietly. The third recording was shorter, filled with emotion that made Sarah's heart ache. "Sarah, honey, if you're listening, I'm sorry. There's something I have to do. Something important. I love you more than..." The message cut off in a burst of static. Doug ran a hand through his hair. "Mrs. Jenkins, I've been doing this job for 15 years. I've never seen anything like this. These messages, they're not normal voicemails. The timestamp shows they're from 3 weeks ago, but they just appeared in our system last night. I want to air them again," he continued. "Tonight's show. We can ask listeners if anyone recognizes the locations, maybe get some help figuring out what happened. The coordinates are a start, but there might be other clues we're missing." Sarah opened her thermos, pouring coffee into paper cups with shaking hands. "You believe me now? That it's really him?" Marcus pushed his glasses up his nose. "The voice pattern analysis matches your husband's previous calls to the station. It's him. What I can't explain is how these messages got into our system." "I don't care how," Sarah said firmly. "I just need to find him." Doug placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "We'll help. I'll dedicate the whole show to it tonight if I have to. Someone out there must know something." Marcus copied the audio files onto a USB drive, handing it to Sarah. "You should have a copy, just in case." Sarah clutched the small device like a lifeline as they walked her to the exit. The morning had grown warmer, the desert air shimmering above the asphalt. She paused at her car, looking out across the parking lot. The wind picked up, sending dust devils dancing across the empty spaces. Beyond the lot, the desert stretched toward distant ridges, painted in shades of rust and gold. For a moment, a lone figure on a motorcycle appeared on the horizon, a dark silhouette against the bright sky. Sarah's heart stopped. She blinked, and the rider was gone, leaving only the wind and the endless desert behind. The morning sun painted long shadows across the gravel driveway as Sarah loaded the last of the supplies into her weathered blue pickup truck. Her hands moved with purpose, checking off a mental list. Bottled water, paper maps spread across the passenger seat, and a small notepad with the mysterious coordinates written in neat, careful numbers. The radio host's car pulled up, kicking up dust as it came to a stop. He stepped out, looking more awake than she'd expected for this early hour. Gone was his usual casual demeanor from the radio booth. Instead, he wore sturdy boots and carried a backpack. "You didn't have to come," Sarah said, though relief colored her voice. "Someone needs to document this," he replied, holding up his portable recorder. "Plus, 2 sets of eyes are better than 1. They agreed to meet at Rosie's Diner just off Route 7. It was where Jack, her husband, always stopped for coffee before his longer rides. The place hadn't changed in 20 years. Same faded sign, Same smell of coffee and bacon greeting them as they walked in. Over eggs and toast, Sarah pulled out the photo of Jack. His gray beard was neatly trimmed in the picture, his eyes crinkling at the corners as he smiled beside his Harley. She traced the edge of the photo with her finger. "Tell me about that last morning," the radio host said gently, setting his recorder on the table. Sarah's coffee cup clinked against its saucer. He was different that day. Usually, he'd be excited about these mercy rides, taking supplies to folks who couldn't get to town easily. But that morning, she paused, gathering her thoughts. He said it would be his last one, said he was getting too old for the long hauls. Did he say why this particular ride was so important? Just that someone needed him. That's all he'd say. Sarah's voice caught. I should have asked more questions. They finished breakfast in contemplative silence before heading out onto Route 77. The desert stretched endlessly on either side, waves of heat already dancing above the asphalt. Sarah's truck led the way, with the radio host following in his car. About 40 miles in, they spotted a sun-bleached gas station. Its faded sign advertised, "Last stop for 50 miles," in peeling red letters. Sarah pulled in, remembering how Jack always topped off here, just to be safe. The bell above the door jingled as they entered. Behind the counter, an older man with weathered skin looked up from his crossword puzzle. His name tag read Earl. "Excuse me," Sarah said, pulling out Jack's photo. "Have you seen this man recently? He would have been through here about 3 weeks ago." Earl adjusted his reading glasses, studying the picture. His eyes widened with recognition. Yeah, the guy with the Harley. Real polite fella." He scratched his chin thoughtfully. "Filled up here. Must have been about 2 weeks back." Sarah's hand gripped the counter. 2 weeks? Are you sure? Pretty sure. It was Tuesday. I remember 'cause my nephew was helping out that day. The biker bought coffee, filled his tank, asked about road conditions up ahead. Earl paused. Seemed tired, but otherwise fine. The radio host leaned forward. That would have been 2 days after he was reported missing. Sarah's heart raced. Jack had been alive, well after everyone assumed the worst. She pressed Earl for more details, but that was all he could remember. Except that Jack had headed east, deeper into the desert. Back in their vehicles, they continued toward the coordinates. The paved road eventually gave way to gravel, then to little more than a trail. Sarah's truck handled it better than the host's car, but they pressed on, dust clouds billowing behind them. The GPS led them to a dry wash beside an old section of highway. A rusted guardrail, bent and weather-worn, marked where the old road had been redirected years ago, and there, propped carefully against the guardrail, was Jack's Harley. Sarah's hands shook as she parked. The motorcycle wasn't crashed or thrown down. It had been deliberately placed, almost reverently, against the rail. The chrome was dusty but undamaged. The engine looked intact. The radio host surveyed the scene, his recorder capturing the sound of their footsteps in the gravelly soil. "The saddlebags are gone," he noted. "And look, footprints." He was right. 2 distinct sets of prints led away from the bike. One matched the tread of Jack's favorite boots. Sarah would know them anywhere. The other set was different, smaller. "Someone was with him," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible over the desert wind. "But who?" They followed the tracks for a few yards before they disappeared into the rocky terrain. The sun beat down mercilessly as Sarah circled back to the motorcycle. She knelt beside it, running her hand along the familiar handlebars where Jack's hands had rested so many times. "Jack," she whispered, her voice catching. "Where are you?" The desert offered no answer, but her phone did. It buzzed in her pocket, startling her. Unknown number. Sarah's hands trembled as she pulled out her phone and saw a voice message notification. The radio host moved closer, his recorder at the ready. Sarah pressed play and held her breath. Jack's voice, clear as day, filled the air. "Sarah, my love, I'm okay. Don't worry about me. Some things just need doing. I'll explain everything soon." They stared at the phone in stunned silence. The message was time-stamped. Today, 10:47 a.m., just minutes ago. The desert wind whipped around them, carrying with it the weight of mystery and hope. The fluorescent lights hummed softly in the radio station as the woman and the host hurried inside. The sun had already set, painting the desert sky in deep purples and oranges. Inside the small broadcast room, the air felt charged with anticipation. The radio host adjusted his headphones and leaned into the microphone. Good evening, desert night owls. If you're just joining us, we've got quite a story unfolding. He glanced at the woman, who sat nervously in the corner chair. Earlier today, we found new evidence in the case of our missing biker, the man who's been helping folks across the Southwest with his mercy rides. He pressed a button, and the biker's recorded voice filled the room. The woman closed her eyes, letting the familiar timbre wash over her. If anyone out there remembers seeing a man on a Harley, late 60s, carrying medical supplies and groceries to elderly folks, please call in. We need your help. The phone lines stayed quiet for several minutes. The host kept talking, filling the airspace with details about the found motorcycle and the mysterious footprints. Then, the first line lit up. Desert Night Radio. You're on the air, the host said. Yeah, this is Big Rick. The caller's voice was gruff but clear. I drive the Phoenix to Albuquerque route. Think I might have picked up your guy about a week ago. The woman sat up straight, her hands gripping the arms of her chair. Can you tell us more about that, Rick? The host asked, his professional demeanor masking his excitement. It was outside that old broke-down diner. You know, the one with the crooked sign near Apache Junction. Found him sitting on the curb. Had a nasty gash on his head, all confused like. The trucker cleared his throat. Thought he was just another homeless fella at first, but he kept talking about finding some voice. Didn't make much sense. The woman grabbed a notepad, her hands shaking as she wrote down the details. Did he say anything else? The host pressed. Not much that made sense. Kept looking at his hands like he didn't recognize them. I dropped him at Pete's Gas and Go, about 3 hours north. Gave him some water and a sandwich. Wish I'd done more now, hearing all this. The host scribbled down the gas station's name. Big Rick, you've been incredibly helpful. Did you happen to notice which direction he headed after you dropped him off? Last I saw, he was heading inside the station. Asked the clerk something, but I had to get moving. Got schedules to keep, you know? After thanking the trucker, the host immediately dialed Pete's Gas and Go. The woman held her breath as he spoke with the manager. Yes, sir. We're trying to locate a missing person. The host described the biker. About a week ago. Yes. He gave the woman a thumbs up. Can you tell me what happened? The host switched to speakerphone so everyone could hear. Oh yeah, I remember him clear as day, the manager said. Not every day someone comes in asking about shortwave radios. Seemed real fixated on that. Said he needed to find the right frequency or something. Did he say where he was heading? The woman spoke up, her voice trembling. Ma'am, I wish I knew. He bought some aspirin and water, used the bathroom, then walked north on the access road. Figured he was meeting someone, but nobody came for him. After the call ended, the host turned to his audience. Folks, we're going to try something new tonight. I'm calling it Voice Watch. From Flagstaff to Las Cruces, Tucson to Santa Fe. If you hear any unusual broadcasts, any voice that sounds like our missing rider, call us immediately. The phone lines lit up like Christmas lights. People called in from all over. A waitress in Sedona who served coffee to a kind stranger. A mechanic in Gallup who fixed a flat tire for free. An elderly woman who found groceries on her porch with a note signed, Route 77 Angel. The woman mapped each sighting, her heart racing. The dots formed a pattern, moving steadily northward, but the dates didn't make sense. Some were from after the trucker's encounter, others from before. It's like he's everywhere and nowhere, the host muttered, studying the map. As midnight approached, the calls slowed. The host wrapped up the show, promising to continue the search tomorrow. The woman gathered her notes, her mind spinning with new possibilities. The technician, who had been quietly monitoring the equipment all evening,
suddenly called them over to his station. "You need to see this." On his screen, a new audio file had appeared in the system. No phone number attached. No source listed. Just a date and time. Tomorrow night, 9:47 p.m. "That's impossible," the host said, leaning closer to the screen. "Nobody can schedule a message to just appear like this." The technician shook his head. "The system logs show it came in through our main frequency, but there's no record of any incoming transmission." The woman stared at the timestamp, her heart pounding. "Can we play it now?" "It's locked," the technician said. "Won't open until the exact time listed." They stood in silence, staring at the mysterious file. Outside, the desert wind whistled through the antenna tower, carrying whispers of tomorrow's secrets into the dark Arizona night. The morning sun cast long shadows across the cracked pavement as Sarah's pickup truck pulled into the parking lot of the Desert Rose Diner. Paint peeled from the building's weathered siding like old sunburned skin, and a neon sign flickered weakly despite the early hour. The radio host, Mike, followed close behind in his station wagon, kicking up dust as he parked. "This is it," Sarah said, clutching her husband's photo. "Where the trucker said he found him." The diner stood alone against the vast desert landscape, a forgotten outpost on a stretch of highway where even tumbleweeds seemed to lose their way. A bell chimed weakly as they pushed through the door, the hinges creaking in protest. Inside, the air smelled of coffee and years of griddle grease. 2 ceiling fans spun lazily overhead, doing little to dispel the morning heat. A few early customers hunched over plates of eggs and toast, paying no attention to the newcomers. An older waitress with faded red hair and kind eyes approached, coffee pot in hand. Her name tag read Betty. "Help you folks?" she asked, already moving to fill the empty cups at their table. Sarah placed the photo on the scratched Formica surface. "We're looking for someone who might have been here about a week ago." Her voice caught slightly. "My husband." Betty set down the coffee pot and picked up the photo, studying it carefully. Recognition flickered across her face. "Oh yes, I remember him clear as day. Sat right out there." She pointed through the dusty window to a bench beneath a weather-beaten awning. Strange thing was, he didn't come inside for the longest time. Just sat there, staring at the sunrise like he was waiting for something. Mike leaned forward, his reporter's instincts kicking in. "Did he seem injured? Confused?" Betty's brow furrowed. "Now that you mention it, he had this bandage above his balmy ear." Kept touching it, like it was bothering him. Muttering to himself too, she paused, looking at Sarah with sympathy. "I thought maybe he was one of those veterans having a rough time. Was going to call someone to help, but then what?" Sarah pressed. "Then that other woman showed up, the sick one." Betty's expression softened. Poor thing was getting her treatments at the hospital in Phoenix. Stopped here on her way back home to rest. You could tell she wasn't doing well, all pale and thin, wearing one of those cancer scarves. Sarah and Mike exchanged glances. "What happened?" "Well, your husband, he just seemed to know somehow. Got up from his bench and walked right over to her table. First words he'd spoken all morning. Asked if he could pray with her." Betty wiped at her eyes with the corner of her apron. "They went outside together. I watched from the window. He knelt right there in the parking lot, held her hands, and prayed. Never seen anything quite like it." Mike pulled out his notebook. "Is there any way to contact this woman?" Betty smiled. "As a matter of fact, she lives right here in town now. Moved to stay closer to the hospital. Name's Marie Carson. She comes in every Thursday for breakfast." She checked her watch. "Matter of fact, she should be here any minute." As if on cue, the bell above the door chimed. A woman entered, wrapped in a light shawl despite the growing heat. Though frail, she carried herself with quiet dignity. Her eyes were bright and alert in her thin face. "Marie!" Betty called out. "These folks here were just asking about that biker who prayed with you last week." Marie's eyes widened. She moved closer, looking at the photo on the table. "Yes, that's him." She turned to Sarah. "Is he?" "My husband."
Sarah said softly. He's missing. Oh, my Lord. Marie sank into the booth beside them, her hand trembling as she reached for Sarah's. I had no idea. He seemed so purposeful that day, like he was exactly where he needed to be. Would you tell us what happened? Mike asked gently, pen poised over his notebook. Marie nodded, tears welling in her eyes. I was having such a dark day. The treatments weren't working like they should, and I was losing hope. I stopped here because I was too tired to drive any further. She took a shaky breath. I was sitting alone, trying not to cry in public, when he approached my table. He had such kind eyes. Sarah squeezed her hand. That's John. He always could see right into people's hearts. He asked if he could sit with me for a moment. Said God had told him someone here needed hope today. Marie wiped her eyes. We went outside. I think he knew I was embarrassed about crying. He knelt right there on the pavement, took my hands, and prayed the most beautiful prayer I've ever heard. What did he say? Sarah whispered. He thanked God for my strength, for my fight. Asked for healing, yes, but more than that, for peace. Then he looked right at me, and said something I'll never forget. Marie's voice grew stronger with the memory. You're not alone, he told me. You'll hear my voice again soon. And when you do, it means the light has found you. She shook her head in wonder. I didn't understand what he meant then. But 3 days ago, I heard him on the radio. Clear as day. That same voice, speaking words of hope. The diner had grown quiet. Other customers listening intently to Marie's story. Even Betty stood still, coffee pot forgotten in her hand. The next day, Marie continued, I went for my scheduled scan. A smile broke across her face like sunrise. The tumors had shrunk. The doctors can't explain it. But I knew, when I heard his voice on the radio, just like he promised. She squeezed Sarah's hand. Your husband is special. He's touching lives even now somehow. The moment was broken by a sudden crackle of electricity. Behind the counter, an old radio mounted on the wall sparked to life. Static filled the air, making everyone jump. The sound wavered, grew stronger, then cleared. Through the speaker came a voice they all recognized. Warm, gravelly, filled with quiet purpose. Home isn't a place. It's the sound of someone remembering you. The neon vacancy sign of the Desert Rest Motel cast a soft red glow through the thin curtains. Inside room 12, Sarah Miller sat cross-legged on the worn floral bedspread, surrounded by papers and recordings. The radio host, Mike Turner, paced the small room, his coffee going cold on the nightstand. Play it again, Sarah said, pushing a strand of gray hair behind her ear. The part about the light. Mike pressed play on his laptop. Her husband's gravelly voice filled the quiet room. Home isn't a place. It's the sound of someone remembering you. The cheap clock radio on the bedside table hummed quietly, its red numbers showing 11:42 p.m. Outside, crickets chirped in the desert darkness, and occasionally a truck would rumble past on Route 77. There's something different about this recording, Mike said, running his hands through his disheveled hair. The background noise, it's... The phone in his pocket buzzed, interrupting his thought. He glanced at the number. Unknown caller. This is Mike Turner, he answered, his voice carrying the professional tone he'd developed over years of late-night radio. Sarah watched as his expression changed, his eyebrows lifting. He grabbed a pen and started scribbling on the motel notepad. Sir, could you repeat that address? Mike's voice had an edge of excitement. And you're certain about the date? He nodded, writing faster. We'll be there first thing tomorrow. Thank you, Mr. Harrison. He hung up and turned to Sarah, his eyes bright despite the late hour. That was Edwin Harrison. Lives up in the Catalina Mountains, about 40 miles north of here. Says he saw Tom. Sarah's hands trembled as she gathered the scattered papers. When? 10 days ago. Says Tom was wandering near his property. Wouldn't accept help. Harrison's one of those off-grid types, former Forest Service worker. He keeps detailed journals of everything he sees up there. Sarah stood up, her joints protesting after hours of sitting. "We need to go now," Mike shook his head. "Those mountain roads are treacherous in the dark. First light, I promise. Get some rest. We'll need clear heads for this." The night passed slowly. Sarah dozed fitfully, dreaming of Tom's voice carried on desert winds. When the first pale light of dawn touched the mountains, they were already in Mike's SUV, climbing the winding road into the Catalinas. The pavement gave way to gravel, then to rough dirt tracks. Pine trees replaced saguaros as they gained elevation. Mike's knuckles were white on the steering wheel as they navigated hairpin turns. "Harrison said he's the last resident up here," Mike explained, checking his notes. "Lives completely off-grid. Communicates with the outside world through shortwave radio." After 2 hours of careful driving, they spotted a metal mailbox with Harrison spelled out in reflective stickers. A narrow driveway disappeared into thick pines. The cabin appeared suddenly, a solid structure of logs and stone, solar panels glinting on the roof. A tall, lean man with a white beard stood on the porch, hands in the pockets of well-worn overalls. "Mr. Harrison?" Mike called as they parked. The man nodded once. "Figured you'd come earlier than you said. Folks always do when they're searching." His voice was rough from disuse. Sarah stepped forward. "You saw my husband?" Harrison's eyes softened. "Ma'am, why don't you both come inside? Got something to show you." The cabin's interior was neat but cramped. Every surface covered with books, maps, and notebooks. A sophisticated radio setup occupied one corner, dials glowing softly. Harrison pulled a leather-bound journal from a shelf. "I draw what I see," he explained, turning pages carefully. "Helps keep the memories straight when you're alone up here." He stopped at a page and turned it toward them. Sarah gasped. The pencil drawing showed Tom perfectly. His weathered face, the small scar above his right eyebrow, even the way his mouth turned down slightly at the corners. He was wearing different clothes than when he disappeared, and no shoes. "That's him," Sarah whispered, touching the page gently. "When?" Harrison tapped the date in the corner. 10 days back. Found him wandering near the North Ridge. Didn't seem hurt, but wasn't quite right in the head neither. Kept talking about voices and finding his way home. "Did he say anything else?" Mike pressed, recording the conversation on his phone. "Said he was following the voices home. Offered him food, shelter. He wouldn't have it. Headed deeper into the hills." Harrison shook his head. "Tried to stop him. Nights get cold up here." But he was determined. Sarah studied the drawing, noting every detail. "Which direction did he go?" Harrison moved a large topographical map on the wall. "Headed northeast toward the old fire tower." "But ma'am, that's rough country. No trails, steep drops. Nobody goes up there anymore." Mike was about to respond when a burst of static came from the radio setup. Harrison frowned, moving to adjust the dials. The static cleared for a moment and a familiar voice crackled through the speakers. "Still here, still walking, still listening." They all froze. The voice was unmistakably Tom's. Not a recording, but live. Sarah gripped Mike's arm. "That's him. That's right now." Harrison's fingers flew over the equipment. "Signal's local, very local. He's got to be within 10 miles of here." The voice came again, clearer this time. "Still here, still walking, still listening." They stood in silence as the words faded back into static, each lost in their own thoughts about what this could mean and what they might find deeper in those lonely mountains. The morning sun painted long shadows across the motel parking lot as the woman and the radio host loaded their bags into his car. Their phones hadn't stopped buzzing since dawn. Calls, texts, and voicemails from listeners across Arizona who claimed to have heard the mysterious broadcasts. "I've never seen anything like it," the host said, scrolling through his messages. "These aren't just random reports. Each person remembers exact words, specific details." He showed her his screen. "Look at this one. An old veteran in Tucson says he heard your husband's voice at 3 a.m. through his grandson's broken radio." The woman leaned against the car, her weathered hands clutching a paper cup of coffee. What did the voice say? That's the thing. Each message seems different, personal to whoever heard it. The host ran his fingers through his graying hair. It's like he's reaching out to exactly who needs to hear him. They drove back to the radio station, where a small crowd had gathered. Some held portable radios. Others clutched handwritten notes. An elderly man in a Vietnam veteran's cap approached their car as they pulled up. "Ma'am," he said, his voice trembling. "I heard him last night, through my old CB radio that hasn't worked in years." Tears welled in his eyes. He knew things. About the war, about the nightmares. He said I wasn't forgotten. The woman touched his arm gently. "Tell me more." As the veteran shared his story, others stepped forward. A retired nurse who heard the voice through her car radio while parked at a rest stop, a trucker who picked up the transmission in the dead of night. A widow who swore her husband's old ham radio sparked to life after years of silence. The radio host watched the growing crowd, an idea forming. What if we could help more people hear him? He turned to the woman. What if we organized something bigger? That's how the Route 77 caravan began. They announced it on the morning show. A convoy of vehicles traveling from town to town, carrying radios and hope. The response was immediate and overwhelming. By noon, the station's parking lot had transformed into a staging area. Pickup trucks, RVs, and cars lined up. Their owners taping hand-painted signs reading Route 77 Caravan to their vehicles. Local news vans arrived, capturing footage of the impromptu gathering. "We're heading out at sunset," the host announced through his portable speaker. First stop, the chapel in Adobe Wells. The woman sat in the passenger seat of the lead vehicle, watching the desert landscape roll past as their caravan snaked along Route 77. In her lap, she held a small radio, the one from their bedroom that her husband used to tune every night before bed. The Adobe Wells Chapel was a simple adobe structure, its white walls glowing orange in the setting sun. Inside, folding chairs had been arranged in a circle. People filtered in, each carrying a radio of some kind. Old transistor sets, modern scanners, even a few antique tube radios that had been carefully transported. A veteran in his 50s stood up, his hands shaking as he spoke. "I was at my lowest point last night," he said, "sitting in my garage, feeling worthless, forgotten." He paused, wiping his eyes. "Then my old military radio crackled, just static at first. But then this voice that seemed to know everything I was feeling." The room fell silent as he repeated the words. "Your fight mattered. Even if they forgot you, I didn't." More stories followed. A hospice nurse described hearing the voice through her patient's radio, offering comfort in their final hours. A former trucker told of picking up transmissions that guided him away from thoughts of suicide. Each testimony was different, yet they all carried the same thread of hope, of being seen when they felt invisible. The woman listened, her heart swelling with a mix of pride and awe. This was her husband, the quiet man who spent his retirement years delivering supplies to those in need, who never sought recognition for his acts of kindness. Even now, lost somewhere in the vastness of the desert, he was still reaching out to help others. "It's not just about finding him anymore, is it?" the host said softly as they stepped outside for air. "This is something bigger." She nodded, watching the sunset paint the desert in shades of purple and gold. He always said everyone deserves to be heard, even when the world stops listening. She touched the radio at her hip. Maybe that's what he's doing out there, making sure the forgotten ones know someone's still listening. The caravan grew as they moved from town to town. People would join for a few miles or a few days, sharing their own stories or simply hoping to hear the voice themselves. Local papers began calling it the mystery of Route 77, but to those in the convoy, it was more like a pilgrimage. That evening, they made camp near a canyon, parking their vehicles in a loose circle. Someone started a campfire, and soon the air filled with quiet conversation and the soft crackle of radio static as people tuned their sets, hoping to catch a transmission. The woman sat in a folding chair, her husband's photo in her lap, watching the stars emerge above the canyon walls. Nearby, an elderly couple had parked their RV, its interior lights casting a warm glow through the windows. Suddenly, the woman heard it. That familiar burst of static that preceded each broadcast. The RV's radio flickered to life on its own, its dial moving without anyone touching it. The conversations around the campfire died away as the voice, his voice, filled the night air. To the one who's still waiting, I remember the porch light you left on. The woman's breath caught in her throat. Every night since he'd disappeared, she'd left their porch light burning, a beacon in the darkness. Somehow, somewhere, he knew. He remembered. And he was still out there, finding his way back to those who needed him most. The morning sun painted long shadows across the desert floor as members of the Route 7 caravan began breaking down their makeshift camp. Coffee percolated in tin pots over small camping stoves, and quiet conversations drifted between the RVs and tents. The woman sat at a folding table, studying the maps they'd marked with reported sightings, when excited shouting broke through the peaceful morning. "Mrs. Thompson! Mrs. Thompson!" A lanky teenager with tousled brown hair came running through the camp, his grandfather trying to keep up behind him. "We found something!" The boy, Danny, had joined the caravan 3 days ago with his grandfather, a retired postal worker who'd heard the broadcasts. In Danny's arms was a weathered leather saddlebag, its edges scuffed and faded from sun exposure. "Where did you find this?" the woman asked, her hands trembling as she reached for the familiar bag. She'd bought it for her husband's birthday 2 years ago. "It was tucked under a saguaro cactus just off the trail where we were walking," Danny explained, catching his breath. Grandpa spotted it. The radio host, who'd been checking equipment in his van, hurried over. Other caravan members gathered around as the woman carefully opened the bag's worn clasps. Inside, the contents told a story of their own. A half-used first aid kit, its white packaging now dusty and worn. Several notebooks with dog-eared pages. And there, wrapped carefully in a bandana, was his Bible. The same one he'd carried through Vietnam, its leather cover now water-stained but still bearing his initials. JT. "Look," Danny pointed. "There's something else." He reached in and pulled out a small tape recorder, the kind journalists used to carry. The woman's fingers found the play button, pressing it with reverence. The gathered crowd held their breath as the tape crackled to life. His voice, though faint, carried clearly in the morning stillness. "If you find this bag, then I'm still not done." There was a pause, filled with the sound of wind. They needed to hear it. All of them. "I'm leaving pieces behind so they remember." The woman recognized the gruff tenderness in his voice, the way it softened when he spoke from the heart. She opened the first notebook with careful fingers, finding pages filled with his distinct handwriting. Neat, but pressed hard into the paper, like each word carried weight. They were messages. Dozens of them. Each one dated. Each one meant for someone specific he'd met along his journey. "To the veteran at the gas station," one read. "Your medals might be packed away, but your honor never faded. Keep standing tall, brother." "For Maria at the Desert Cafe," another began. "Your son would be proud of how you've carried on. The flowers you plant still bloom in his memory." The radio host gently took one notebook, turning pages with growing amazement. These are all people he met. People he helped. He looked up at the gathered crowd. Some of these dates are after he disappeared. An elderly woman in the group stepped forward, adjusting her glasses. That's my name," she whispered, pointing to one entry. "I met him at a truck stop 2 weeks ago. I was stranded with a flat tire, and a kind man helped me change it. He told me stories about his wife while he worked." She wiped her eyes. "I never knew his name." The woman kept turning pages, her heart beating faster as she recognized references to their life together woven through his words to others. Then she found it. a page with her name at the top, the ink slightly smeared as if written in haste. When I'm quiet, listen closer. I'm not lost. Just further down the road than you. She pressed the page to her chest, feeling the indent of his words against her heart. The morning air grew warmer as the sun climbed higher, and a desert wind began to stir the dust around their feet. "Look!" Danny suddenly called out, pointing toward the canyon edge that rose behind their camp. "Someone's up there." Everyone turned to look. Against the rose-colored rocks, a solitary figure walked slowly along the ridgeline. The rising sun cast their shadow long against the canyon wall. For a moment, the figure paused, as if looking down at the gathered group. Then, without hurry, they moved behind an outcropping of rocks and disappeared from view. The woman stood frozen, the notebook still clutched to her chest, as the wind picked up around them, carrying the scent of sage and desert flowers. No one spoke. They all stared at the empty ridgeline, the morning sun now fully risen, turning the canyon walls to gold. "That's the third sighting this week," the radio host said softly, breaking the silence. "Always at dawn, always near the high ground." The woman nodded, her fingers tracing the words in the notebook. The messages were more than just notes. They were a trail of breadcrumbs, each one marking a life her husband had touched on his mysterious journey. Whatever had happened to him, whatever was still happening, she now held proof that he'd never stopped thinking of others, never stopped trying to help those in need. She carefully returned the notebook to the saddlebag, alongside his Bible and the tape recorder. The wind continued to blow, making the canvas tents flutter and the desert brush dance. The caravan members slowly dispersed back to their morning tasks, but something had shifted in the air. A sense of purpose, of being part of something larger than themselves. Danny's grandfather placed a gentle hand on the woman's shoulder. "We're getting closer," he said with quiet certainty. "Every day, we're getting closer." The woman nodded, looking back at the ridgeline where the figure had been. The morning sun had transformed the desert into a landscape of light and shadow, each rock and cactus casting long fingers across the sand. Another day of searching was beginning, but now they had more than just radio voices. They had his words, his thoughts, evidence of his continuing journey written in his own hand. The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty parking lot of Gill's Gas and Minimart as the caravan pulled in. Their vehicles formed a tired line, pickup trucks, RVs, and sedans, all covered in a thick layer of desert dust. Sarah, the woman who started it all, stepped out of her truck and stretched her stiff muscles. The radio host, Mike, was already fiddling with equipment in the passenger seat. His usual confident demeanor had given way to quiet determination as he adjusted dials and checked connections. "Anything?" Sarah asked, though she already knew the answer from his furrowed brow. He shook his head. "Dead air. Just like yesterday." The other caravan members gathered around, their faces showing varying degrees of concern. Old Jim, a Vietnam vet who'd joined them 3 towns back, leaned heavily on his cane. "Maybe we should wait here a spell," he suggested. "Give him time to reach out again." But Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out. She pulled out the worn leather journal they'd found in the saddlebag, its pages now dog-eared from constant reference. The rest of the group dispersed to fuel up and grab supplies, leaving her alone with the host. "I keep thinking about Angel's Rest," she said, spreading the journal on her truck's hood. "Tom always said it was a special place. Something about the way the mountains cup around it. Like hands holding a secret." Mike nodded, but his attention was still on his portable radio scanner. The device's screen showed nothing but flat lines where signal peaks should be. 2 days, he muttered. Longest silence since this whole thing started. A young woman from the caravan approached them, carrying coffee from the mini-mart. "My grandmother used to tell stories about Angel's Rest," she offered. "Said it was a place where lost souls went to find their way home. Before the mines dried up, of course." Sarah flipped through the journal pages until she found the drawing that had been nagging at her mind. the radio tower with the lightning bolt. The ink was smeared, but the message beneath it remained clear. When the voice goes dark, look for the light that never sleeps. She traced the words with her finger, remembering how Tom used to say things like that. Simple words that held deeper meaning. "Mike," she said suddenly, "what if he's not broadcasting anymore because he's waiting for us to figure something out?" The host finally set down his equipment and took a proper look at the drawing. That old tower near Angel's Rest, it's been dead for years, but... He paused, thinking. But it's still standing. And if someone wanted to send a signal, it would be perfect, Sarah finished. High ground, clear line of sight, and nobody would think to look there. The rest of the group had started gathering again, drawn by the intensity of their discussion. Sarah held up the journal, showing them the drawing. "We've been following Tom's voice," she explained. "But maybe now, we need to follow his footsteps instead." Some nodded in understanding, while others looked skeptical. The silence of the past 2 days had shaken their faith. A few had already talked about heading home. "Look," Mike addressed the group, standing straighter. "I've been in radio for 20 years. Signals don't just appear and disappear like this without a reason. Whatever's happening, that tower might be our best chance at understanding it." Sarah spread out a map on the hood next to the journal. The old tower was marked with a faded X, about 30 miles north of their current position. The road there would be rough, mostly unmarked dirt tracks winding through the hills. "It'll be dangerous," she admitted. "The roads aren't maintained anymore, and there's no cell service out there." "We've come this far," old Jim spoke up. "Ain't turning back now." One by one, the others voiced their agreement. Even those who'd been doubtful seemed to draw strength from the group's resolve. They spent the next hour preparing, checking vehicles, filling extra water containers, making sure everyone had emergency supplies. The ghost town of Angel's Rest might not have seen visitors in years, but today it would host a caravan of believers. As they pulled out of the gas station, Sarah kept the journal open beside her. She'd read every entry so many times she practically knew them by heart. But something about that tower drawing kept pulling at her attention. The lightning bolt. Was it just decoration? Or was Tom trying to tell them something more? The convoy wound its way through increasingly rough terrain. Dust clouds billowed behind their vehicles as they navigated the narrow paths. Every few miles, someone would try their radio, hoping to hear that familiar voice break through the static. But only silence answered. The sun climbed higher, casting harsh shadows across the rocky landscape. Sarah checked her watch. Nearly noon on their second day, without contact. Her hands tightened on the steering wheel as worry gnawed at her gut. What if they were wrong? What if they were driving away from Tom instead of toward him? Mike must have sensed her doubt. "He's out there," he said firmly. "I've spent my whole career being skeptical of everything. But this is different." We all felt it. They drove on, the tower's silhouette growing larger against the horizon. The old structure stood like a lonely sentinel, its metal framework catching the sunlight. As they got closer, they could see the remains of the control building at its base, windows long since broken out by desert winds. The caravan parked in what used to be the tower's maintenance lot. Everyone sat in their vehicles for a moment, as if gathering courage. The silence felt heavier here, more deliberate somehow. Sarah reached for her personal radio, the one she'd been carrying since this all began. Her fingers trembled slightly as she held it close. "Say something," she whispered into the static. "Please, say something." For a long moment, there was nothing but the soft hiss of dead air. Then, like a bolt of lightning through the quiet, a single word crackled through the speaker. Closer. The morning sun painted long shadows across the desert as the caravan of vehicles wound their way toward Angel's Rest. Dust clouds billowed behind their tires, creating a ghostly trail that stretched back toward civilization. In the lead vehicle, the woman gripped the steering wheel, her knuckles white with tension. The radio host sat beside her, scanning frequencies on a portable radio, though they both knew the silence had lasted for days now. "There it is," the host said, pointing to a structure that rose from the horizon like a skeletal finger, the old radio tower of Angel's Rest. As they drew closer, the abandoned mining town revealed itself. A collection of weathered wooden buildings, their windows either broken or boarded up, their walls bleached gray by decades of harsh sun. A general store's sign hung crooked, creaking in the wind. The radio tower's metal frame had surrendered to rust, its red warning lights long dead. The caravan parked in what used to be the town's main street. About 20 people climbed out of their vehicles, their faces a mixture of hope and apprehension. The woman stood still for a moment, taking in the desolate scene. Something about this place felt different. Final. "We should split up," the host suggested. "Cover more ground." They broke into small groups, checking the buildings one by one. The woman found herself drawn to a collapsed shed near the base of the radio tower. Its roof had partially caved in, creating a triangular space beneath the weathered boards. As she approached, her heart skipped a beat. A corner of a blanket peeked out from under the debris. She crouched down and carefully pulled it free, revealing items that made her breath catch. Empty water bottles, their labels bleached white by the sun. A pair of torn boots, the leather cracked and worn. And there, wrapped in a ball, a bandage stained with dried blood. "Over here!" she called out, her voice trembling. The host and several others rushed over. They examined the scene in silence, the gravity of their discovery weighing heavily in the air. One of the veterans in their group knelt down to study the ground. "Footprints," he said, pointing to marks in the hard-packed earth. Heading east, they followed the tracks, which meandered unsteadily across the desert floor. After about 50 yards, the prints became erratic, as if the person had been stumbling. Then, abruptly, they vanished where the ground turned to loose sand. One of the caravan members, a young man with a drone, offered to do an aerial survey. The small aircraft buzzed to life, rising into the cloudless sky. They gathered around his control screen, watching as the drone's camera swept across the barren landscape. "Wait," the operator said suddenly, zooming in on something. "There's something down there." About 2 miles from their position, near a dry creek bed, lay what appeared to be a dark shape half buried in sand. The woman's heart seemed to stop. "We need to get there," she whispered. They took the 4-wheel drive vehicles, bouncing across the uneven terrain. As they got closer, the shape became clearer. A body, wearing a leather vest, partially covered by drifting sand. The woman's legs gave out before she reached it. The host caught her as she stumbled. The rescue medics who had joined their caravan approached the body carefully. One knelt down, checked for vital signs, then looked up with sad eyes. "I'm sorry," he said softly. "Based on the condition, he's been gone for days." The woman collapsed to her knees, a wail of anguish tearing from her throat. The sound echoed across the empty desert, a cry of loss that seemed to shake the very air. Members of the caravan bowed their heads, some wiping away tears. The radio host placed a gentle hand on her shoulder as she sobbed. The voice had been real. All those messages, all those encounters, they had happened. But now, looking at the still form before them, the truth was undeniable. Her husband had been out here all along, wandering, helping others, even as his own strength failed. The afternoon sun began its descent, casting long shadows across the desert floor. The group carefully moved the body back to the radio tower, where they began setting up a small memorial. They gathered rocks to make a circle, placed candles inside empty jars, and hung his recovered vest on a piece of the tower's framework. The woman sat quietly on a fallen beam, holding the last voicemail device in her hands. The caravan gathered around as she pressed play, their faces illuminated by the setting sun. His voice, now achingly familiar to them all, filled the desert air one last time. "When the road ends, I'll leave you the sky." The words hung in the silence that followed. The wind picked up, howling through the canyon with an eerie, mournful sound. The candles flickered in their glass shelters. Then, impossibly, A voice crackled over a nearby radio left sitting on the hood of a truck. The same voice. His voice. The woman's head snapped up, her eyes wide with disbelief. Everyone turned to stare at the radio, then at the body that still lay motionless under a respectful cover. The host reached for the volume dial with a trembling hand, turning it up. Through the static, clear as day, came the voice they all knew. The voice of a man who, by all evidence before them, was no longer alive. The woman stood frozen, tears still wet on her cheeks, as the impossible broadcast filled the gathering darkness. The desert air grew still. Every member of the caravan stood frozen, their eyes darting between the lifeless body and the crackling radio that somehow carried the biker's voice. The sound was crystal clear, unlike the static-filled broadcasts they'd heard before. If you're hearing this, I guess I've moved on. But my voice, it doesn't end with me. The radio host's hand trembled as he held his microphone, recording everything. The technician, who had insisted on joining the caravan 2 days ago, pushed his thick glasses up his nose and frowned at his equipment. "This isn't possible," he muttered, checking readings on his signal detector. "The transmission, it's local. Very local." He pointed toward the old radio tower that loomed above them, its metal frame catching the last rays of sunlight. "It's coming from right there." The woman wiped her tears and stood up shakily. "What do you mean?" "I mean," the technician said, gathering his tools. "Someone set up a transmitter in that tower, recently." The group moved toward the structure, their flashlight beams cutting through the growing dusk. At the base of the tower, partially hidden by tumbleweeds, they found a metal box covered with desert dust. Solar panels, weathered but functional, were angled perfectly to catch the morning sun. The technician knelt beside it, his fingers working quickly. "This is ingenious, actually. Simple but effective." He opened the box carefully, revealing a mess of wires connecting to an old CB radio and a modified tape deck. It's voice-activated. When the solar battery builds enough charge, it powers up and plays the next message in sequence. The radio host leaned in closer. "He set this up himself?" "Must have." The technician nodded. "Look at these dates marked on the tapes. He's been recording messages here for days, maybe weeks." The woman touched one of the tapes gently. Her husband's handwriting was unmistakable on the labels. Each one had a name or description. For the trucker who stopped, for the woman at the diner, for the veteran who served, and dozens more. The voice continued from the speaker, warm and familiar. "I knew I might not make it back. The headaches were getting worse, the dizzy spells. But I couldn't stop. Not while there were still people out there who needed to hear something good, something true." Members of the caravan gathered closer, many wiping tears from their eyes. The cancer survivor from the diner parking lot held onto her husband's arm, her face peaceful as she listened. "So I started leaving these messages," the voice continued. "A little light for each dark place I found. Because sometimes all we need is to know someone remembers us. Someone sees us, even after they're gone." The technician found a stack of notebooks next to the equipment. He documented everything, every person he met, every story he heard. He was planning this all along. The radio host flipped through one of the notebooks, his professional skepticism melting into wonder. "Look at this." He mapped out when the sun would hit the panels each day, calculated how much power he'd need for each broadcast. He made sure these messages would keep playing for weeks. Then the voice changed tone, becoming softer, more intimate. "Sarah." The woman's breath caught in her throat at the sound of her name. "My dear Sarah, you waited. You believed. I didn't walk alone because you lit the way." Tears streamed down her face as she listened to her husband's voice, so clear and present it was as if he stood beside her. "I'm sorry I couldn't make it back to you. The accident, it did something to my head, made me confused. But even when I couldn't remember my own name sometimes, I remembered your voice, remembered how you'd wait up for me, that little light on the porch burning until I came home." The group maintained a respectful distance as Sarah sank to her knees beside the transmitter, one hand reaching out to touch it gently. I started feeling worse after the crash. Knew I didn't have long, but I couldn't just disappear. Couldn't let my last act be silence. So I found this old tower, figured out how to make it work, spent my last days recording these messages, helping who I could along the way. The technician quietly explained how the system worked, how the biker had rigged it to broadcast on different frequencies at different times, ensuring his messages would reach across the desert to all the lonely places he'd visited. Each person I met, the voice continued, they were all looking for the same thing. Not miracles, not even answers. Just acknowledgement. Someone to say, I see you. You matter. Sometimes that's all the light we need to keep going. The cancer survivor nodded, tears in her eyes. That's exactly what he did for me, she whispered. So I leave you these voices, these little echoes. Let them be your light when the road gets dark. Let them remind you that someone cared enough to stop, to listen, to remember. The sun had set completely now, but the solar-powered system continued to run on stored energy. The voice grew softer, more tired, but no less determined. Sarah, my love, don't keep waiting by that porch light. Take it with you. Share it. There are so many others out there in the dark, needing just a moment of brightness. Just a voice saying, I see you. The radio host looked at his notes, at all the stories they'd collected along the way. He turned his own goodbye into a gift for others, he said quietly. Sarah stood slowly, her grief transforming into something else, understanding, perhaps, or purpose. She walked to the base of the tower, its metal frame cool against her palm. She closed her eyes and smiled through her tears, feeling closer to her husband than she had in weeks. You found your way home, she whispered, her words carried away by the gentle desert wind. The morning sun painted the desert in shades of amber and rose, casting long shadows across the weathered buildings of Angel's Rest. A small group gathered near the old radio tower, their faces solemn in the early light. Folding chairs formed a rough semicircle, and someone had draped an American flag over a simple wooden podium. The woman stood before them, her silver hair catching the sunlight. Her hands trembled slightly as she unfolded a piece of paper, but her voice rang clear and strong across the quiet desert morning. My husband wasn't a man of many words, she began, managing a small smile. But when he spoke, people listened, not because he was loud or demanding, but because he understood what it meant to be heard. Behind her, volunteers moved quietly through the abandoned buildings, carefully collecting the scattered pieces of her husband's final journey. The radio host supervised as they photographed and labeled each item. Empty water bottles, torn maps, handwritten notes on scraps of paper. He spent his retirement years doing what he called mercy rides, she continued, her voice catching slightly, delivering supplies to those who couldn't get them themselves. But his real gift wasn't what he brought. It was how he made people feel less alone. The technician worked methodically in the shed where they'd found the first signs of the biker's presence. He documented everything with careful precision, marking locations and taking photographs. As he examined the worn floorboards, his flashlight beam caught an inconsistency, a loose board that didn't quite match the others. Even in his final days, the woman's voice carried on outside. He never stopped thinking of others. Each voice message, each prayer, each moment of connection, it was his way of leaving light behind in dark places. The technician gently pried up the loose board. His breath caught as his flashlight illuminated a small cavity underneath. There, wrapped carefully in an oil-stained cloth, lay a cassette tape. The label, written in steady block letters, read, "For when I can't speak anymore." The ceremony concluded as the sun climbed higher, the small group dispersing to help with the collection efforts. The technician approached the woman, holding out the tape with reverent care. "Ma'am," he said softly, "I think you should see this." She took the tape with trembling fingers, running her thumb across her husband's familiar handwriting. The radio host appeared at her side, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. "We have equipment back at the station," he offered. "We can listen to it there." The day passed in a blur of careful documentation and packing. Every item they found told part of the story. A story of a man who knew his time was limited but chose to use what remained to help others. By evening, they had gathered in the radio station's small break room. The woman sat closest to the speakers, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The host dimmed the lights and pressed play. There was a moment of static, then a familiar voice filled the room. "If you're listening to this," the biker's voice was rough but clear, "then I guess the road finally ran out, but there's something you need to know about what happened out here." He described waking up in a stranger's cabin, his head wrapped in bandages, his memories scattered like leaves in a storm. The survivalist who found him, a man who'd retreated from the world after his own traumas, had saved his life, but couldn't save him completely. "The head injury was bad," the biker's voice continued, "but it wasn't what was killing me. The doctors had already told me about the growth in my lungs months before. I just couldn't tell you. Couldn't bear to see you worry. The crash just sped things up." The woman pressed her hands to her mouth, tears sliding silently down her cheeks. The radio host placed a box of tissues beside her. "That man in the hills, he wanted me to stay, to let him call for help. But I knew I didn't have much time left, and there was something I had to do first." The tape crackled with his deep breath. "I kept hearing voices on his old radio set. People so lonely, so lost, just like I was after Nam. And I knew this was my last mission, my final ride." He described his journey, setting up the solar-powered transmitter, recording messages, walking from town to town despite his failing strength. Each person he met, each soul he touched, became part of his farewell tour. "The cancer was spreading fast," he admitted. "Some days I could barely walk. But every time I heard someone say they felt less alone, it gave me strength for one more mile, one more message, one more chance to make a difference." His voice grew softer, more reflective. "I'm not afraid of dying. I've seen enough of death to know it's just another kind of road. What scared me was leaving you alone. But then I realized, maybe I could leave something behind, something that would keep speaking even when I couldn't anymore." The woman reached out and touched the speaker, as if she could reach through time and touch him one last time. "So I set up the broadcasts, used what I learned in Nam about radio systems. The survivalist, he taught me about solar power before I left. Said I was crazy to go, but he understood. Soldiers know about final missions." There was a long pause, filled only with the sound of his breathing. "Every message I left, every prayer I shared, every hand I held, it was all a way of saying goodbye. Not just to you, but to this world that still has so much good in it, if we just take time to listen." The tape crackled again, his voice growing tired but peaceful. "Don't remember the end," he said finally. "Remember the ride. And know I was never lost, just waiting for you to hear me." The tape clicked to a stop, leaving the room in profound silence. Through the window, the desert stars were beginning to appear, twinkling like distant radio signals in the vast Arizona night. The morning sun filtered through the blinds of Channel 12's small studio, as Sarah Martinez, the peppy morning show host, adjusted her earpiece. The woman sat quietly in the guest chair, her husband's weathered notebook resting in her lap. Next to her, the radio host fidgeted with his collar, unused to being on the other side of an interview. "We're live in 3, 2, 1, the floor director called out. "Good morning, Arizona. Today we have an incredible story that's been unfolding right here in our backyard," Sarah began, her practiced smile genuine and warm. "A mysterious voice on the radio, a missing biker, and a journey that touched countless lives across our state." The woman watched as they played the opening segment. Clips of the caravan, shots of Route 77 stretching endlessly into the desert, and finally, her husband's voice crackling through an old radio. "When the road ends, I'll leave you the sky. The studio went quiet. Even the cameraman seemed moved. That voice belonged to James Miller, Sarah said softly. A Vietnam veteran who spent his retirement years helping others through what he called mercy rides. His wife Eleanor is here with us today, along with radio host Mark Stevens, who helped share James's story with the world. Eleanor squeezed the notebook tighter. It's still hard to believe sometimes, she said, her voice steady despite the emotion behind it. James always said he wanted to help people feel less alone. Even after he was gone, he found a way. Mark leaned forward in his chair. When Eleanor first called our station that night, I thought it was just grief talking. But then the calls started coming in. People who'd never met James were hearing his voice exactly when they needed it most. They played another clip. This one from the solar-powered transmitter at Angel's Rest. To whoever's listening right now, you matter. Someone remembers your name. Someone sees your fight. Sarah dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. The response to this story has been overwhelming. Our phone lines are already lighting up. We have a caller from Phoenix. Roger, you're on the air. An elderly man's voice trembled through the studio speakers. I need to share something. 3 months ago, I was sitting in my garage, with my service pistol. 50 years of nightmares after Vietnam. I couldn't take it anymore. He paused, gathering himself. Then my old radio turned on by itself. A man's voice, your husband's voice, told me I wasn't forgotten, that my service mattered. That voice saved my life. Eleanor closed her eyes, tears sliding down her cheeks. Stories like this had been pouring in ever since the first broadcast. Each one felt like a gift from James. And now, Sarah continued, you're taking this message of hope on the road. Tell us about Route 77 Redemption. Eleanor opened the notebook, showing the camera the hand-drawn logo James had sketched years ago. A highway sign with wings. We're converting RVs into mobile aid stations, she explained. Medical supplies, food, radio equipment, everything James used to carry on his bike, but on a larger scale. We'll travel to small towns, helping the forgotten ones he cared so much about. The first convoy leaves next week, Mark added. We've got retired nurses, counselors, veterans, all volunteers, and every vehicle will be equipped with a special radio system playing James's archived messages. They showed footage of the RVs being painted with the Route 77 Redemption logo, volunteers loading supplies, and the small radio station they'd built into the lead vehicle. The response has been incredible, Eleanor said. People from all over the country are sending in their own stories, asking how they can help. James always said that kindness leaves echoes. I guess he was right. Sarah turned to the camera. For viewers just joining us, we're going to play one more clip. This was found on a cassette tape in James Miller's final resting place. The studio speakers crackled with James's voice, stronger and clearer than the radio broadcasts. I learned something out here in the desert. Hope isn't just a feeling, it's a frequency. Sometimes all people need is to know their signal got through, that someone heard them. Remember that. And if you're listening to this someday, remember, you're not broadcasting into empty air. Someone's always tuning in. After the interview, Eleanor declined the station's offer of a car service. She needed to drive herself home, needed the quiet of the desert roads to process everything. The morning show had already generated hundreds of calls and emails. People wanted to volunteer, donate RVs, share their own stories of hearing James's voice. Back in her trailer, Eleanor sat at the small kitchen table. Sunlight streamed through the window, catching dust motes in its beam. She opened James's notebook to its last used page, his final written message to her. Then she carefully turned to the first blank page. Her hand trembled slightly as she picked up a pen. James had always known exactly what to say to people who were hurting. She wasn't sure she had that gift, but she knew she had to try. Someone out there was waiting for a message, just like all those people who had heard James. She looked at the empty page and thought about Roger, the veteran who had called in, about the cancer patient from the diner, about all the lonely souls still tuning in, hoping to hear a voice that told them they mattered. Eleanor took a deep breath and began to write, "To whoever finds these words when they need them most." Her pen moved steadily across the paper, carrying forward the legacy of a man who had understood that sometimes the greatest mercy was simply being heard. Through the window, a desert wind stirred the chimes James had hung years ago, their gentle music mixing with the sound of her pen on paper, like a radio signal finding its way home. The autumn sun was setting as Sarah pulled into her driveway, the gravel crunching beneath her truck's tires. The house looked exactly as she'd left it weeks ago, a modest single-story with faded blue paint and white trim. The porch light glowed steadily, just as it had since the day her husband disappeared. She sat in the truck for a moment, hand still on the steering wheel, watching that faithful light. It had been her beacon of hope, her way of saying, "I'm still here," to a man who might never come home. Now, it stood as a testament to a different kind of homecoming, not the one she'd prayed for, but meaningful all the same. Taking a deep breath, Sarah grabbed her bag and stepped out of the truck. The desert air was cooling rapidly, bringing with it the familiar scent of creosote and dust. Her boots made hollow sounds on the wooden steps as she approached the front door. The key felt heavy in her hand. Inside, the house was still and quiet, preserved in the moment she'd left it. Their life together remained frozen in the details. His coffee mug in the dish rack, his reading glasses on the side table, his favorite chair tilted at the exact angle he preferred. The helmet, that old black motorcycle helmet with the scratched visor, sat by the door where he'd always kept it. Sarah ran her fingers along its surface, feeling every nick and scrape. Each mark told a story of miles traveled, of people helped, of mercy given freely on endless desert roads. Her throat tightened, but the tears didn't come. Not yet. Moving through the house, she began the careful process of unpacking. There were boxes from the caravan, items collected from Angel's Rest, pieces of his final journey that now needed homes on her shelves. His journals, the voice recordings, photographs taken by fellow travelers who joined their search. Each item carried the weight of memory, of revelation, of understanding. In the bedroom, she opened his closet. The familiar smell of leather and aftershave washed over her. His riding jackets hung in a neat row. He had always been particular about maintaining his gear. Sarah reached for the oldest one, the brown leather worn soft with age. It was the jacket he'd worn on their first date, the one he'd draped over her shoulders on cool desert nights. As she lifted it from the hanger, something fluttered to the floor. A folded piece of paper, yellowed at the edges. Her hands trembled as she picked it up, recognizing his precise handwriting. "If you came this far, then I made it too. You gave me the strength to go. But now it's your turn. Light the way for someone else." The tears came then, not in a flood, but in gentle waves. They weren't tears of loss or grief, but of profound gratitude. He'd known, somehow he'd known, that she would need these words exactly when she found them. Sarah walked to the kitchen window, holding the letter close to her heart. The sunset painted the desert in shades of purple and gold, the same colors that had filled so many evenings they'd shared on the porch. She remembered how he used to say that twilight was when the desert spoke its truths, when the day's heat gave way to night's wisdom. Moving with sudden purpose, Sarah went to the garage. She found an old piece of wood, part of a project they'd never finished, and some paint. Working carefully, she crafted a simple sign. The letters weren't perfect, but they were clear and strong. For anyone still looking, you are seen. She mounted it beneath the porch light, which glowed more warmly now in the deepening dusk. Standing back, Sarah felt something shift inside her, a gentle realignment of purpose. Her husband's mission hadn't ended with his passing. It had evolved, transformed, and now lived on through her and everyone he'd touched. The evening air grew cooler. Sarah went inside and made a pot of coffee, filling the house with its comforting aroma. She moved through the rooms, turning on lamps, making the space feel lived in again. The silence didn't feel empty anymore. It felt expectant, like the pause between movements in a symphony. She was sitting in her husband's chair, looking through one of his journals, when she heard it. A hesitant knock at the door. Sarah set down the book and walked to the entrance. Through the window, she could see a young man standing on her porch, shifting his weight nervously. She recognized him from the caravan, one of the veterans who'd joined their search, though they'd never spoken directly. His eyes were downcast when she opened the door, his hands stuffed deep in his jacket pockets. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. I didn't know where else to go." Sarah looked at him, really looked at him, and saw what her husband must have seen in so many others, someone searching for light in the darkness. Without hesitation, she stepped aside and gestured him in. "Come on in," she said warmly. "Let me turn on the radio." The young veteran crossed the threshold slowly, as if afraid to disturb the peace of the house. Sarah moved to the old radio on the shelf, the same one that had first brought her husband's voice back to her all those weeks ago. She turned it on, and soft static filled the room, a gentle reminder that sometimes the most important messages come through the noise. The porch light continued to shine outside, steady and true, while inside, two people who might never have met without one man's final journey sat down to share their stories in the growing night. The desert sun painted long shadows across roadside as the converted RV rumbled steadily along the highway. Inside, weathered maps and photographs covered the walls, each marking a stop where someone had needed help, a kind word, or just a reminder they weren't forgotten. The woman sat in the passenger seat, her silver hair catching the late afternoon light. Her fingers traced the worn edges of her husband's notebook, now filled with new stories alongside his old ones. The radio host adjusted the broadcast equipment mounted on the dashboard. Unlike the cramped station where this journey began, their mobile studio now housed state-of-the-art gear. Screens displayed incoming calls from across 3 states. But the old analog radio still held its place of honor, a reminder of where it all started. "Signal's strong today," the host said, checking the levels. "We're reaching all the way to New Mexico." He glanced at her with a gentle smile. "Think it's time?" She nodded, looking at the mic he offered. It felt heavy in her hands, not just plastic and metal, but the weight of continuation, of carrying forward what her husband had started. The host flipped a switch, and the familiar on-air light glowed red. Before speaking into the mic, she closed her eyes and took a deep breath. When she opened them, the vast Arizona landscape stretched before her through the windshield. Endless sky meeting endless earth. "To anyone listening," she began, her voice gentle but steady. "The road is long, but you're not walking it alone. We're still out here, and we remember your name." The words hung in the air for a moment before the first call light blinked. Then another, and another. "This is Sarah from Tucson," came the first voice, trembling slightly. I heard your husband's voice last month when I was ready to give up. He said something about the dawn always coming, even in the darkest night. I've been holding on to that." The woman smiled, remembering finding those exact words in one of his journals. "The dawn does come, Sarah, and you're not alone anymore." More calls followed. A veteran in Phoenix who'd been living in his car. An elderly woman in Las Cruces who hadn't spoken to another person in weeks. A truck driver who'd been battling depression on the lonely highways. The host handled the technical side while she spoke to each caller, sharing pieces of wisdom from her husband's journals, adding her own gentle insights. The RV continued its steady pace down Route 7, a mobile lighthouse broadcasting hope across the airwaves. "We've got supplies," she told a caller from a small town ahead. "Water, food, basic medical supplies. But more than that, we've got time. Time to listen. Time to remember your story." Through the windows, they passed the familiar landmarks. The broken-down diner where he'd prayed for the sick woman. The canyon where they'd found his saddlebag. the distant hills where his voice had first returned through the static. Each place now held new meaning, marked not just by loss, but by the hope that had grown from it. In the back of the RV, volunteers sorted care packages and managed the growing database of people they'd helped. What had started as a search for one man's voice had become a mission to amplify all the voices that needed hearing. A young man called in, his voice rough with emotion. I heard him too. Last week, on an old radio in my garage. He said something about how the strongest light comes from the darkest places. I thought I was going crazy. You weren't crazy, she assured him. Sometimes the messages find us exactly when we need them most. She shared how her husband had always believed in the power of simple kindness, how he'd spent his retirement years doing mercy rides for strangers. The host adjusted some dials, expanding their broadcast range. The signal stretched further, reaching into places where people had forgotten they could be heard. Each call that came in added another thread to the tapestry of connection they were weaving across the Southwest. We're coming up on sunset, the host said during a break. Want to do one more? She nodded, taking the mic again. The RV crested a hill, and the vast desert spread out before them, painted in deep oranges and purples as the day prepared to close. To everyone still out there, she said, her voice carrying across the airwaves, whether you're in your car, your home, or somewhere in between, you matter. Your story matters. We're here, we're listening, and we'll keep driving these roads until every voice gets heard. The last rays of sunlight stretched across the desert, casting long shadows across the sand and sage. Through the passenger window, she watched the rocky ridges pass by. Their silhouettes sharp against the darkening sky. For a moment, she caught a glimpse of what looked like a lone motorcycle rider on a distant ridge, a familiar silhouette against the setting sun. But when she blinked, there was only the empty horizon. She smiled, feeling a deep peace settle over her. The mission hadn't ended with her husband's passing. It had only transformed. His voice had started as a whisper on Route 77, but now it had become something bigger, a beacon of hope, carried forward by all those who needed to know they weren't forgotten. Still walking, she whispered, echoing his words. Still listening. The RV continued down Route 77 as darkness fell, its antenna broadcasting comfort into the night, its headlights illuminating the road ahead. Inside, the calls kept coming, each one a reminder that sometimes all it takes to change a life is knowing that someone out there remembers your name.